Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Notes on the News. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the biggest stories related to film, media, and entertainment, and give you my thoughts. If you joined us live, super happy to have you. If at any point during the show you have any comments or questions about any of the topics that I'm covering tonight, feel free to leave a comment in the live chat. For some reason, it's not working on my desktop, but I do have this up on my phone, so I'll try to keep an eye on the live chat, see if maybe we can get a conversation started. If you haven't already, please like the live stream. It really does help with the algorithm and having other people find the channel. Really trying to grow the channel, if you will. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Again, it would really help in those efforts. If you're watching this after the fact, also super happy to have you. By the time you're watching this, there should be time codes in the description, so you can kind of jump around at your leisure. We stream this live stream every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And again, same as like I said before, please like this video if you haven't already. And please subscribe so that way you never miss an episode, never miss a live stream, and all that good stuff. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, let's take a look at the box office from this past weekend. So, for those following the show, I have switched to a new box office design. I took some comments and suggestions from people and have made a little bit of modifications to it. So feel free, if you still have comments about it, feel free to drop them in the chat or comment on this or what have you. But let's take a look at the box office. So, opening this week, we have at number one Twisters, right? The sequel, I guess like semi-sequel. So, from my understanding, it's essentially a standalone sequel. That it's not, it doesn't really have anything to do with the original, but it still takes place in the continuity. So it's not quite a reboot. But in any case, this is done very well. So it opened to 80.5 million for the weekend, which was a big success considering that it was projected to be anywhere from 72 to 79. So it didn't wildly exceed expectations, but it definitely still exceeded at least my expectations, right? And again, the fact that, this has been kind of the story of the 2024 box office, in that, we were in a malaise for so long that even the biggest films opening, like for the longest time, Dune Part 2 had the biggest opening, and it was only like, what was it? Like maybe this, but maybe even less, right? Like it may have been even like 65 or 70 million when it opened. But Inside Out 2 really just blew the doors open, and I think it just got people. It got people in the theaters, and then when they're there and they're eating the popcorn and they're seeing it on the big screen and they're seeing trailers, that people, I think it had the effect of people going, I miss going to the theater. I like doing this. Why haven't I done this? So I think we're seeing a lot of movies that if they had opened in March, wouldn't have done as well, right? And again, you can make the argument, well, of course the summer is always going to be better because the summer just always is better. And people are out of school, if you're, a kid, or even if you're in college or something. But in any case, just the fact that this movie, off of an IP that is really not super recognizable, right? The original Twister is not this, iconic film by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's a film if you were maybe, a teenager or, a young adult in, the mid-90s. But I think it's kind of been lost to time in a way. But anyway, so this is done pretty well, and it had the best per theater average for the weekend, about 19,000 per theater, which is again pretty strong. As you can see on this list here, it far exceeds any other film here, and this brings its worldwide total to about 123 million off of about a $175 million budget. So it still hasn't made its money back by any stretch, but again, this is just off of that first weekend, and from what I've heard, it's had pretty good word of mouth. So expect this to be a decent player in the weeks ahead. Also opening this week is, I feel like this is like every week we're talking about this. There's this an Indian film called Bad News with a Z, coming in at number 8. Bringing in just a little bit more than $1 million for the weekend, opening in just about 477 theaters. And this is another import that is making it into the top 10. Again, I don't know why this keeps happening, that the United States, we can't make enough movies to perform well enough that all of our films in the top 10 are domestic releases. But in any case, I did want to highlight that there. Films continuing this week. We have Long Legs bringing in just under 12 million, and this constitutes a 48% drop. But an actually increase in the amount of theaters. If you see here, they actually added about 340 theaters for the weekend, excuse me. So that's not like a great drop, but it's also not disastrous, right? And again, the fact that this movie opened as big as it did, it was already a success, even if it was for one weekend only, right? But so now every dollar it makes after that is just icing on the cake. People I still have yet to see it. Am I going to see it? I was originally going to go see it last week, and then it just got too hot. I'm sorry. New York City, if I had a car and I could drive and be in the AC until I get to the theater and then just hop out and run into the building, that'd be a different story. But sometimes I just have to cancel some of these screenings I'm going to because it's just too hot. But this goes to show, if you have a cheap horror film that has an interesting concept, people will come out and it can kind of make that money back. So this brings its domestic total to just under 45 million and its worldwide total to about 47 million. Again, off of just a $10 million budget. So this has easily crossed the doubling its budget threshold to break even. So I'm sure, the creators of this film are happy about this, right? Also continuing this week, in its second weekend, is Fly Me to the Moon, the kind of romantic comedy drama about faking the moon landing, I guess, which did not open very well, and it is not good news for if you're part of the Fly Me to the Moon creative team. So this weekend it brought in just a little bit more than about 3.3 million for the weekend, and this constitutes almost a 65% drop. And no theaters were taken out. So it had the same amount of theaters as last weekend, and it's just not worth, basically less than $1,000 per theater, right? And obviously it's different all across the country, but let's say average movie theater ticket is like $12 or something, right? That means that each theater only had 82 people coming, roughly, right? 82 or 100 people. This brings its domestic total to about 16 million. Its worldwide total to about 31, but off of a $100 million budget. Again, this definitely went to the cast, right? Because you have a lot of big names in this cast. So it's very unlikely this is even gonna get back to the 100, let alone doubling its budget at 200, right? 200 million. Looking at a couple other films here, still in the top 5, we have Despicable Me 4 in its third frame. It dropped from first to second. Twisters dethroned the Minions, if you will. It brought in about 24 million for the weekend. This was about a 45% drop. And this brings its domestic total to about 259 million domestically and 574 million worldwide off of just a $100 million budget. So, like I said last time, the Minions rule. They are a consistent box office player, to the point now where I feel like Illumination is just on autopilot. I have not seen this film, but from my understanding, it's just another Despicable Me movie, right? Also continuing, it's really, really strong still, is Inside Out 2. It's held its third place spot in its sixth frame, brought in just a little bit under 13 million for the weekend, which was only about a 36% drop, right? So this is far and away the most successful movie of the year, and I think now it's the second most successful animated film of all time. And of course, that's not factoring in inflation, right? Because of course, movie tickets are just more expensive now. So of course, newer movies it's easier to get to certain box office thresholds. But in any case, that's still impressive, right? So this brings its domestic total. This is just domestic. To about 596 million for the weekend, and 1.4 billion worldwide. And 596 not for the weekend, but domestic total. So it's made about $1.5 billion off of a $200 million budget, which is easily one of the more expensive films of the year. But again, it's brought the money in, so it's a pretty good percent return. We're looking at, like, it's over 600% return, right? So and this isn't over, right? It's still what's a million? A million 7 digits. So we're still in 8 digits, right? It's not even below 10 million. So this could still just keep going and going for the summer. Which, if you know anything about me, you know that annoys me because I'm not a huge fan of Inside Out or Inside Out 2. But in any case, it's, again, it like I said before, it blew the doors off. It kind of shook people out of their malaise, so I have to give it credit for that. Also in the top 5, we have A Quiet Place Day 1. Excuse me there. I forgot to mute myself. So we have A Quiet Place Day 1, dropping from 4th to 5th in its 4th frame now, bringing just a little bit more than about 6.1 million. This is about a 46% drop, so it's holding all right. This is not a huge moneymaker, but it has been a moneymaker, right? So this brings its domestic total to about 128 million, and its worldwide total to about 241 million, off of just a $67 million budget here, right? So it is still a percent return. It has doubled its budget. This will, reinforce, I think, to Paramount, like, this is a franchise worth continuing. Because I believe this is basically on par with the other films so far. In terms of the opening, it was. But we'll have to see. Like, because, again, I'm not really sure. You can't really go anywhere with the 2 original films. I feel like that story's over. Like, the second film already felt like it was, like, kind of pushing it. And with this story, it kind of ends in a way you can't really continue it. So I don't know what they're going to do. But I'm sure it's someone's job at Paramount right now to figure out how can we continue this franchise. A couple other notable, entries in the top 10. We still have in the top 10 Bad Boys Ride or Die, only dropping from 6th to 7th in its 7th frame. So this thing's been out for almost 2 months. And it still brought in, about 2.7 million for the weekend. Only a 37% drop, right? So this is something that, like, you gotta say, like, although it's disappointing to see this box office, like this top 10, and how much of it is sequels or reboots or connected to some other IP. Because let's look here. So the only thing that's not based off of an existing IP would be Longlegs, Fly Me to the Moon, Bad News, presumably, and The Bike Riders. That might be based off of a book. I can't remember. But for all intents and purposes, we'll just say for it's not based off of another film IP, right? So that's really disappointing. But I will say that looking at these, there is a diversity in a way, right? So with Twisters, we kind of have like an action disaster film. Bad Boys, we have like an action comedy. Fly Me to the Moon, we have a romantic comedy. Quiet Place is more horror. Longlegs is horror. Inside Out 2 and Despicable Me are animated. Maxine is more indie critical darling, or what was supposed to be a critical darling, right? So there is kind of a diversity here. And I think that's helping all the films, so they're not necessarily what are people, like, if you're not going to see Bad Boys Ride or Die, like, what are the other films in this top 10 are you going to see instead, right? So it kind of helps give each film a little niche that it can kind of perform well in. So this brings its domestic total to about 189 million and 388 million worldwide. Again, off of just a $100 million budget. So again, this has definitely been successful. And then also, we have The Bike Riders, interestingly, had dropped out of the top 10. It was at 15th place last week. It is now back in the top 10, right at number 10, in its 5th weekend. Brought in less than $1 million, only brought in about 700,000 for the weekend. But I'm not sure why this happened. It had a 75%, 76% jump. And usually when you see that, it's because they added theaters. But this, they cut theaters. It looks like they basically cut this by more than 50%. It was only in 308 theaters, and it cut 416. So it was left with less than half of whatever it was last weekend. So I have no idea why this kind of popped off. But it has not been financially successful. It only has brought in about 21 million domestically, about 34 million worldwide, off of like a $35 million budget, right? So it hasn't even broken even, and it hasn't even crossed that threshold. So, but again, films like this are more about the critical, being critical darlings. But again, something like Bike Riders was not a huge critical darling. It was well received, but not universally well received. It's not, like, I don't think you're really going to see anything about this movie at like the Oscars or awards season or anything like that. But it's definitely going to be interesting next weekend because we have Deadpool. And I'm really interested to see how Deadpool is going to shake all this up. Maybe that's where you start pulling away from Bad Boys Ride or Die, right? Like another action comedy. Who's to say? Okay, before we continue, I just want to give a quick plug to Cinema MCU. So it's not just a YouTube channel. It started as and still is a Substack newsletter where I write more formal written reviews for new films coming out. My latest review is up on the newsletter for A Quiet Place Day 1. You can find the link to the newsletter to subscribe in the link below. You can also go to your browser and type in cinemancuso.substack.com. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink here. Okay. Let's talk about story number 1. So Joe and Anthony Russo, in a move that was surprising when I read the headline, but not surprising after I thought about it for more than 5 minutes, Joe and Anthony Russo are in early talks to direct the next 2 Avengers films per The Hollywood Reporter, right? So this would be a return for the directing duo. It would be a return for them back to the MCU, because of course, notably, they directed Captain America Winter Soldier, which led them to directing Captain America Civil War, which of course then led them to direct Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, right? And the Hollywood Reporter notes in their article about this that, not for nothing, these 4 films combined have grossed about $6.7 billion worldwide, right? So this makes sense that they would be coming back, because... So basically, they kind of left the MCU machine after Endgame, which makes sense. It was like the perfect kind of, cutoff point, right? But they've been working within the system for 5+ years. I think they were ready to do something new, and that's not really been successful for them. They've had some successes in the producerial capacities, like I believe their production company helped produce Everything Everywhere All at Once, which of course was very successful, both critically, but also people forget commercially. It had like a very strong box office run. But in terms of like their films that their directed films since Endgame have not been well received. I feel like the most notable was The Gray Man, which was kind of like an action thriller for Netflix that was not super well received. And they've had like couple other films that again are even less noteworthy than that, right? So GameSpot notes that this news or this leak or whatever you want to call this comes right before San Diego Comic-Con, which of course is where, has been the MCU's almost kind of like forum for the past, 15 years, right? And Kevin Feige this year is scheduled to give a presentation on the future of Marvel movies, which, as we know, have been struggling, which we'll talk about a little bit in a bit. But, so also just for context, because... they're figuring out the directors right now. So the films, it's not like they're coming out tomorrow. So right now, Avengers 5 is scheduled for May of 2026. And then Avengers 6, which is titled Avengers Secret Wars, is scheduled for May 2027. So what's the context of all this? So, the next phase after Endgame, or really the next saga, right? Because then there was like the first 3 phases, but it was all part of the Infinity Saga. So we have phases 4, 5, and 6, but the idea is that they're now part of the multiverse saga. The whole kind of conception, from my understanding, of this saga was built around Kang, right? Played by, at the time, Jonathan Majors, right? And Destin Daniel Cretton was set to direct Avengers 5, which was called Avengers: The Kang Dynasty. Cretton was the director of a couple indie films, notably Short Term 12, which is like a pretty well-regarded indie film. And then, of course, he then went on to direct Shang-Chi. So that's kind of the Marvel in. But Cretton exited the project in November 2023, just before Jonathan Majors was fired from his role as Kang in December of 2023 due to all of his legal issues. I've done stories about that you can go find on this channel. But in any case, they realized, shit, we put all of our eggs in this Kang basket, and now we're, pardon my French, fucked, right? So, and not only did they remove Jonathan Majors as the character, they removed the subtitle. So instead of being Avengers: The Kang Dynasty, right now it's Avengers TBD, right? So we're just calling it Avengers 5. And Sean Levy was offered the job to direct, right? So during this moment of chaos, they're trying to figure out who's going to lead these, because we don't know what the script's going to be. I mean, they're working on it, but, we don't, at least we as the public, we don't really know what the focus of Avengers 5 is going to be. We don't know who's going to be directing it. And I did a story a couple weeks ago, actually, about Sean Levy, who had been offered the job twice. He is the director of a bunch of films that have been critically or commercially dubious, but Hollywood seems to love him. He must be really persuasive in the room, in a pitch meeting. And he is the director for the upcoming Deadpool and Wolverine film coming out this upcoming weekend, right? So, like I said, they had offered it to him. He had said no, and then they came back a couple months later and were like, "Hey, do you want to do it still? Hey, how about now? You want to do it?" So, why this is happening now with the Russo brothers leads me to either believe he turned it down again, or maybe they revoked the offer. Maybe they're worried about Deadpool and Wolverine, which seems unlikely, though, since it's tracking to be the biggest film of the year thus far. Potentially opening at like $200 million. And of course, Disney's a corporation. So if the movie was going to make $1 gajillion, but they didn't think the quality was that great, they wouldn't care. They would be like, "Oh, the movie's going to make a lot of money." So I'm skeptical of the idea that they revoked the offer. Just again because the film, this film seems to, it's going to be a box office juggernaut. Whether that's fair, that's really due to the film or the quality of the film, or just a confluence of factors like we haven't had an MCU movie in a while. It's the return of Deadpool. It's the return of Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. It's sure to have a bunch of multiversal, hijinks and cameos. So whether or not, looking at the theoretical success of Deadpool and Wolverine, whether or not it's really fair to accredit that to the film itself is irrelevant, right? So now we have the Russo brothers now back in contention to direct these two films. And I'm not mad about this, right, by any stretch of the imagination, right? Because, I haven't sat down and ranked the MCU movies. But those 4 films that they did, at least 2 of those are like the best 2. And all 4 of them are some of the franchise's best, right? I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of Winter Soldier and Endgame. I like them. I think they're good, but I think they're a little overrated. But because of MCU movies, they're not always very great. Being pretty good still kind of puts you ahead of the pack. So I'm not mad about this because these 4 films are, help define what the MCU is for a lot of people, right? But what makes this story interesting, to me at least, is what does this say about the franchise, right? Is this going to be a return to form, or is this a sign that Marvel really doesn't know what to do, right? Because you have this kind of both sides having struggled since Endgame, right? Marvel famously has not done super well critically or commercially most importantly, since Endgame. So there's this idea that like, okay, we're gonna go back to the well of these 2 directors, and see if we can have lightning strike twice. Which is dumb, depending on how they do that, because the franchise getting stale is one of, if not the main reason the franchise has struggled, right? The idea of Marvel fatigue, right? So I'm not sure if it's gonna be in their best interest to just be like, let's just do what we did before. But again, both sides have struggled, right? So Marvel has struggled, and like we outlined before, the Russo brothers have not been very successful. So it's kind of like, it's like when a couple breaks up, and then a couple years later they kind of rekindle their relationship, and it's like, look, we haven't had any good prospects ourselves on our own. Why don't we maybe give this another go? So, in a vacuum, I'm cautiously optimistic and excited about this because again, I like their films within the franchise. But if the idea is just like, we just gotta replicate what we did when we were successful, I think that's gonna blow up in their face. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay. Let's talk about story number 2. So Disney has been hacked by a hacktivist group, which is a thing, right? Named Null Bulge, based out of Russia. On the left here, you have their logo, which is like of a furry, of a lion. It's very sexual, and I kind of tried to crop it out, but as you can imagine by the name Null Bulge, let's just say there's a bulge, a very pronounced bulge, just below where I cut this off. So per the Hollywood Reporter, the group describes itself as, quote, a hacktivist group protecting artists' rights and ensuring fair compensation for their work, end quote. And according to the group, which basically published an email sent out to all the publications explaining why they've done this, in their own words, they said, quote, Disney was our target due to how it handles artist contracts, its approach to AI, and its pretty blatant disregard for the consumer. We released the data because we knew making demands would do jack shit. If we said, hello Disney, we have all your Slack data, they would instantly lock down and try to take us out. In a duel, you better fire first. So they claim to have, and over the past week, we've kind of through a drip feed, we have been getting info from this. So the claim is becoming more and more substantiated. They claim they have over a terabyte of data. Now, to put that into context, a terabyte is, I believe, 1,000 gigabytes, right? And 1,000, and because we're talking mostly about text information, that's probably, we're talking more about megabyte and kilobytes. So again, let's do here. So let's do terabyte to megabytes. So 1 terabyte is about 1 million megabytes. This is a lot of info, right? So this includes internal communications, images, logins, studio information, ad campaigns, info on unreleased projects, and more, right? In an email to Variety, again, the group claimed to gain access via, quote, a man with Slack access who had cookies, end quote, which is why you should always reject cookie use. They also go on to say, quote, the user was aware we had them. He tried to kick us out once, but let us walk right back in before the second time, end quote. I think from what I was reading, he was, like, adding a video game add-on. Like, they do this, they, like, create a fake video game add-on that has, like, malicious, like, malware in it. So when you, like, add the add-on, so someone got fired, right? Someone was doing something on their computer they weren't supposed to be doing, probably. Not that it was, like, illegal, but just, like, if it's from what I understand, it was this video, like, why were you playing video games and using a video game add-on on your work computer, right? And unlike other times companies are hacked, no ransom was sought. Again, it's a hacktivist group. So again, like activism. So it's ideologically motivated. And they said, like I said before, they were, really looking to kind of make a statement on the way they feel Disney treats the consumers and artists. The Hollywood Reporter notes that this follows several data breaches for other media companies, not from this group necessarily, but we've seen earlier this year data breaches and hacks with Roku, with Ticketmaster, with AT&T. So this is becoming more and more of a problem, and this is very reminiscent of the Sony hack from a decade ago. So if you're not aware of this, or maybe you're aware of it but don't know that's related to any kind of hack of Sony was going to release a film by Seth Rogen called The Interview about trying to assassinate Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea. North Korea was not happy about this, so they hacked Sony. And the result was this releasing of all of these very damning email exchanges between Scott Rudin, who's like one of the worst people ever, and Amy Pascal. Very email exchanges that you wouldn't want to be public. So kind of making semi-racist remarks, making sexist remarks. So it kind of feels, whereas that was ideological, but in the sense of like it's like a geopolitical governmental thing. It's similar in the idea that there's no ransom to be paid. It is they want to do damage to the company. And again, like I said, a reason, like they don't like the way Disney and other corporations are handling artificial intelligence and how it could potentially destroy or basically disappear a bunch of jobs. So again, in this leak and we're still getting info about it and what kind of, revelations we're getting. But a couple things that have been revealed is traffic and revenue data for Disneyland Paris. There's info about a potential upcoming recommendation feature on Disney Plus. There was info about a sequel to the video game Aliens Fireteam Elite, which is like a video game set in the Aliens universe, as well as more info about the Fortnite and Disney collaboration we already knew existed, but it has more info about it, right? So ultimately with this, I'm conflicted, or conflicted's not even the word, I'm more ambivalent. I'm agnostic about this whole thing, because I really have no tears shed for mega corporations like Disney, right? You are a company valued on the stock market. You have a market cap of nearly $180 billion, right? If a random Russian hacking group, can pull something off like this, it sucks to be you, Disney. It's not cool if this group starts sharing employees' personal info, right? Because they're just like normal people. But again, their macro principles are valid. I'm not necessarily saying it was right one way or the other to do what they did, but like reading their kind of mission statement here, I'm kind of like, shit. Like, short of the hacking part, I kind of agree with everything you're saying, right? Corporate America sucks. So, it's going to be interesting if we're going to have more revealing and damning exchanges or leaks about projects or company, ambitions. Because, again, this is like a semi-developing story, even though this happened kind of earlier last week. But, again, it's one of those things, like, I don't really care in the sense of, like, I don't feel bad for Disney. They just need to, they have all this money. Like, if you're not going to pay your workers a living wage, at least beef up your cybersecurity. Like, you know what I mean? You have all this money. I don't know. It's just an example of this is going to keep getting worse and worse. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay. Let's talk about story number 3. So the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, has criticized Microsoft's move to raise prices on its gaming subscription service, Xbox Game Pass. So now the baseline standard tier for the streaming service is not only degraded but now more expensive, right? So you used to be able to get day one releases. So the idea would be that any title that's like owned and produced and distributed by Microsoft or published by Microsoft, if you had this standard tier and then all the tiers above it, if you had Game Pass, you'd be able to play it the same day it released, right? So you wouldn't have to go buy a copy. You could just play as part of your subscription. They're taking this away from the cheapest Game Pass subscription, and the price is going up. So it used to be $11 a month. Now it's going to be $15 a month. Then you have the Ultimate plan, which of course is still going to have day one releases, but that's also being raised from $17 a month to $20 a month. And these price hikes are going to go into effect in September. We have a quote here from the FTC saying, quote, Microsoft's price increases and product degradation, combined with Microsoft's reduced investments in output and product quality via employee layoffs, are the hallmark of a firm exercising market power post-merger. Product degradation, removing the most valuable games from Microsoft's new service, combined with price increases for existing users, is exactly the sort of consumer harm from the merger the FTC has alleged, end quote. So what merger are they talking about here? So a little bit of context. I'm trying to remember when this officially went through. I think it was maybe like near the end of last year. Microsoft acquired Activision Blizzard. Activision Blizzard, which is itself the product of a merger between Activision and Blizzard. Activision Blizzard is one of the biggest publishers in the gaming industry, and series that are part of Activision Blizzard's library include things from Call of Duty and World of Warcraft. I can basically just say those two. There's like a bunch more, but those two alone are like huge moneymakers by themselves, right? So obviously, one of the biggest publishers and one of the key console manufacturers buying one of the biggest publishers was definitely going to raise some eyebrows from the DOJ in terms of potential antitrust issues. But they were able to successfully fend off such antitrust scrutiny. Because of course there was concern that this would hurt consumers. For example, Call of Duty is famously a multi-platform franchise. If Microsoft now owns Call of Duty, is Call of Duty gonna, become exclusive to Xbox consoles? Or Maybe not as bad, but still bad. Is it going to be something where it's going to be day one on Game Pass? So it's like, why would people, if you have both, why bother getting the PlayStation version? It's going to hurt Sony and even PC versions. But Microsoft tried to suggest that this move would actually be good for consumers. This acquisition of Activision Blizzard would be really good for consumers, which is the argument every company makes when it's trying to get an M&A process through to the finish line, right? So the FTC is looking at Microsoft's decision to now raise these prices, and again, not only raising prices, but actually taking away features. While there's nothing specific about this regarding Activision Blizzard IP, the FTC is trying to appeal this decision, right? The decision to allow this acquisition to happen. Earlier this year, Microsoft laid off nearly 2,000 employees from Activision Blizzard, like from these acquired teams. And the FTC says in their appeal, quote, Microsoft's post-merger actions thus vindicate the congressional design of preliminarily halting mergers to fully evaluate their likely competitive effects and judicial skepticism of promises inconsistent with the firm's economic incentives, end quote. So basically they're like, they feel emboldened to do this because the value of this has gone up because we were able to consolidate, right? And again, it reflects issues with late-stage capitalism, right? Like, ultimately, the way capitalism is designed, that over time, even if it takes decades, the industry, different sectors and industries move closer and closer to consolidation and mergers and acquisitions, to the point where it will eventually become, these companies will become too big, and it'll crash. Either the company will crash or the whole industry will crash into a bunch of little pieces, and then they'll start over, right? And so you'll have all these smaller companies that will eventually merge or go out of business or get acquired, and we'll kind of see the cycle again, right? So this also speaks to, this question around, is streaming the future of gaming? We've seen streaming is not the future of film and TV, in the sense that it can't replace linear TV or the theatrical experience. People still want streaming as an option, but it's not going to replace those things, right? Is gaming going to be different, right? Microsoft is a very smart company, right? So you don't raise prices like this unless you're pretty confident people will pay for it. People will, or at least even if you have people that decide I'm not going to pay for it, enough people will pay for it that it makes up, because of the price increase, it will make up for the people that don't renew or never sign up in the first place, right? So it raises interesting questions of, is Microsoft, I think I read somewhere that the price increase is less of a reflection of their confidence in game streaming and more of just a way to raise some money following this like $69 billion acquisition, right? But in any case, it's, Xbox, this might be like the one like unique thing that it has going for it. Ultimately, Game Pass is like the Netflix of gaming. So, having the Activision library is definitely going to help them. As with all streaming services, the library is what makes it valuable. That's a perfect segue. Let me just grab a quick drink here. Okay. Let's talk about story number 4. So, per Bloomberg, Apple is considering bringing more licensed content from other studios to its streaming services, right? So for context, Nielsen reports that Apple TV Plus, their streaming service, which is different than Apple TV, right? Because that's just, a way where you can rent and buy movies, but Apple TV Plus is like the monthly subscription service. Nielsen reports that Apple TV Plus, has about less than 1% of total TV viewership, right? And that's not necessary, and that makes sense because they don't have a lot of original content, right? But I have not actually watched a lot of Apple TV Plus original content, but from my understanding, it is very, very good. So you can see a picture here of the show Severance. From my understanding, people are comparing it to like the early days of HBO, where like there'll just be one show on for a season for like 8 or 10 weeks, and then a new show will start. Like, it's not like you have like 12 things going on all at once. So it's this idea of quality over quantity. But as we know with streaming services, quantity You both matter. You need quality, but you also really need quantity, right? That still matters. So a big thing with Apple TV Plus, the streaming service, is that there's not a bunch of other studios' content, right? As opposed to like when you go on Netflix, like, you know, you can watch, maybe not anymore, but like, you know, famously you could watch The Office, or you could watch Friends, or Breaking Bad. These were not Netflix shows, but they licensed them, right? Apple TV Plus doesn't really have a library like that, right? And notably compared to their peers, you know, IndieWire notes that other services that are manned by non-studios, so we're not talking about Disney Plus or Max or Peacock, but we're talking about like Netflix and Amazon, you know, they have bolstered their libraries in other ways, right? So Amazon bought MGM, right? Which is obviously, now it's like, okay, now we can put all that on there. And then Amazon also, like Netflix, you know, licensed other iconic shows, right, to help build out the library. So this report from Bloomberg illustrates a shift in strategy, right? I've always felt, you know, like you can make Apple TV Plus a place to get non-Apple. You have to make this a place to get non-Apple content, right? You can't just have these little silos. It helps that Apple TV Plus, at least for the time being, is like one of the cheapest, not the cheapest. It's only like $5 a month or something. Really, really affordable. But probably if you did a cost breakdown, the amount of content you're getting for it is probably actually more expensive than something like Netflix in a way. So the question here is that they're already shifting the strategy. Will they follow suit with like an Amazon? Could they buy an iconic studio, right? That has like a decades, if not a century, of content, right, to pull from. Frankly, well, not frankly, because the whole thing is a clusterfuck. But in some ways, I'm almost, because of this, you know, this report, I'm almost surprised they didn't put their hat in to bid on Paramount, right? Because that would be, you know, that's a long storied studio that again has been around for about a century. It has all this content from both Paramount proper and then all of the you know, acquisitions. So like CBS and what is it, like MTV and Nickelodeon and Comedy Central, and all of those assets could really help Apple TV in that regard. But ultimately, they probably won't buy a studio like Paramount or buy any studio. It's probably just going to come down to getting more licensed content, right? Which I've always said is the way this, you know, it was the streaming industry worked really well. Well, for a few reasons. One, because the bubble hadn't burst, because people kept looking at growth as opposed to profit, number one. Number two, there weren't many players. But thirdly, and I think this is most importantly, there was a balance in the sense that you had Netflix, which did make some original content, but for it really building up into a success enough to be able to make its content, it had to license everything. So it benefited Netflix because they got the content, and it benefited the studios because they got basically passive income on these properties, right? It was when the studios got greedy and went, we want our own streaming service. And it's really dumb. So we have Jason Kilar, who's the former CEO of Warner Media before it was then spun off to Warner, to make Warner Brothers Discovery. He recently talked about that he believes the future of streaming services of like film and TV is going to be a lot more like Spotify and Apple Music, right? Because ultimately those two services, as well as other ones like Amazon Music or Google or like all the different platforms, they all have the same libraries, right? There's not really much original content, and when something doesn't have it, it's because of like, you know, something like the big Spotify, you know, situation where people were pulling their music off because of Joe Rogan, right? So the competition between these companies is more based on price and the quality of service, right? And again, it's better for the industry when there's a divide between production, distribution, and exhibition, right? So, you know, I think the future of streaming is going to be more like Jason Kilar says, more like Spotify and Apple Music, where the studios are licensing their content to most, if not all, of these third-party services. And what people decide to do, which one they decide to go with, will be based on other factors, not necessarily if you have the content, right? Because again, think about it like this. Like the analogy would be like if in the music sphere you had a streaming service just for Warner Music, and then you had a streaming service just for Sony Music, and then like that seems really strange, right? To our understanding, because we have things like Spotify and Apple Music that just has everything, and notably people can self-upload, right, or publish, right? So I think I agree with Jason Keeler. I think that's going to be the future, and Amazon and Apple seem the best poised to become hubs for other streaming services, right? In that, in addition to having their streaming services, you can also buy and rent movies and TV shows. So I think it's the natural next step to not only be able to buy and rent movies on these services, and then also have a monthly subscription service, but then also having the option to use your Hulu account, use your Peacock account or your Max through Amazon, through Apple, through their interface, so that you can have everything in one place. I think that's going to be the future. It's just a matter of when will the studios wise up, not if. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay. Let's talk about story number 5. So a report from Bank of America analysts suggests that Warner Brothers Discovery is, quote, not working, end quote. The report is titled, Is Unbundling the Answer? And we have a quote here from the report saying, the, quote, current composition as a consolidated public company is not working. At current levels, we argue that exploring strategic alternatives such as asset sales, restructuring, and or mergers would create more shareholder value versus the status quo, end quote. So, for context, Warner Brothers Discovery is the result of merger and consolidation, right? So the Hollywood Reporter notes that it was born from a $43 billion spinoff of Warner Properties from AT&T to Discovery in 2022. In the current state of Warner Brothers Discovery, it's a very bloated company, right? I almost want to say it's people use the expression too big to fail. I almost feel like this is a company that's too big to succeed, right? It's bloated. It has film studios, it has linear cable channels, it has a streaming service, it has all the gaming, and you can have all of those, but it's definitely not helping for Warner Brothers specifically. Like, Disney's really good at the cross-pollination, at the vertical or horizontal integration, whatever you want to call it. Warner Brothers, I don't know if they've really been able to capitalize on that, right? So there are a few suggestions from this. There's a few specific suggestions from this report by Bank of America analysts. Number one, they could spin off CNN. That's potentially worth like $6 billion. They could explore a merger or a partnership with another broadcast network. Maybe they pursue some kind of joint venture streaming service. Maybe with like a Paramount, and so instead of having Max and Paramount Plus, they could create some other new one that includes both of their libraries. Again, to kind of justify having your own service, you need the library of content that a lot of these studios just don't have, right? They could spin off Warner Brothers Games, their video game division. That could be worth up to, I think the report said, about $5.6 billion. And the biggest suggestion, or the one that's getting the most attention, is the idea of spinning off all of the linear assets into a separate holding company. So again, by linear assets, I mean all of like the network and cable and all the channels, all the TV channels. In the report, we have a quote here saying, quote, in this hypothetical scenario for potential restructuring, WBD, Warner Brothers Discovery, could spin off the DTC, direct-to-consumer, and studio assets to a new entity unburdened by the constraints of a high debt load, leaving the linear assets with a significant amount of debt on the remaining company, end quote. So the idea, the THR notes that essentially this other company would be saddled with about $40 billion of debt, right? So that way, the main company, the one that's left, that has the studios and the streaming, the direct-to-consumer stuff, that isn't as burdened by the debt, and it can grow better or quicker, or both. And again, it reflects an issue with the current state of capitalism in the United States. Again, maybe consolidation was a bad idea, right? Being huge can be useful when the industry is strong, but it's disadvantageous in any other scenario. Right? And again, like I said, with Disney, they're really good at maximizing. It's like 1 + 1 = 3. Like, they have this asset, which is valuable. They have this asset that's valuable. And then they're able to maximize each asset because they're both under the same umbrella. Does CNN benefit from being in the same umbrella group as HBO? Probably not, right? Not particularly. You know, there's talk that maybe they would just sell Warner Brothers Discovery wholesale. I don't think they would do that, because again, more consolidation wouldn't necessarily help, right? So I think the future of the entertainment industry are going to be smaller companies, but more partnerships, right? So a great example of this is the joint venture sports streaming service that's going to be launching Venue Sports, which is a collaboration between Disney and Warner Brothers and Fox. That's a great example, right? Because it's not that Disney and Warner Brothers and Fox are merging. It's that they are collaborating on this one thing. I think that's going to be the future, right? So you're going to have so instead of having companies working together because they're both owned by the same person, you're going to see more partnerships and collaboration, but then they are disconnected enough so that if something fails here, it doesn't bring down an entire, segment of the economy, right? And again, it seems like the stock market likes the idea of this report, the idea of splitting off the film and streaming efforts from linear assets, or rather, I say the reverse, spinning off the linear assets. And ultimately, David Zaslav, who's pictured here, is the CEO of Warner Brothers. He's notably very ruthless businessman in the terms of he'll just cancel films that are already completed so that they can take a tax write-off. He is primarily motivated by money and his stock options and his bonuses, right? He's a product of the markets, right? He will do whatever he has to do to raise the stock price. So the market, the price going up slightly on the news of this, I think sends me a signal at least that Zaslav, may be considering this. He might be considering doing something like that if it can help his bottom line. Okay, let's just, before we wrap up, let's just look coming up to the weekend ahead. We have Deadpool and Wolverine, the third Deadpool film, but it's also kind of an MCU film. I'm not quite sure how to classify it. We'll have a better idea once it comes out. Right now, it's projected to make anywhere from about 176 million to 181 million. I've also seen some lower estimates. I've also seen some much higher, like all the way up to 200 million. This is where I'm settling. So if you've been following the show, my predictions suck. So from now on, I'm really just looking at other people's predictions and then kind of trying to come up with like an aggregate range within those predictions. But even still, I'm kind of putting some brackets around this. But again, I have been wrong so many times. For all we know, it's going to be a $400 million opening, and it's going to be the biggest, most successful movie of all time. But in any case, even if it exceeds this or not, this number is still good here. That even this lowest range would still be the biggest opening of the year. So I think the strategy of giving audiences time away from the MCU in Marvel movies could very well help them in this case. Okay, so I just want to give a few quick plugs. So this isn't my only channel. I also have a sister channel called Peter Squared, where I cover topics also related to film, media, entertainment, but in a more visual video essay format. The video I have up now is called A Closer Look at Frozen, where, you guessed it, I take a closer look at the Disney film Frozen, taking a look at what went right, what went wrong, and everything in between, using this old and young cartoon versions of myself. It would really be a huge help if you could go check out that channel, subscribe, check out the video, leave your thoughts in the comments. You can find the link to that channel in the description below. Also want to give a plug to a podcast I do with my fiance Viviana called Now That's What I Call a Franchise, where we pick a film franchise and we go through every single installment, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We just recently wrapped up our season on the Addams Family. Starting this Friday, we're going to be starting the Star Wars franchise, which is very, very exciting for me. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts, as you can see here. You can also find us on YouTube, if that's your preferred way of listening to podcasts. You could also, find the link in the description below. And finally, I just want to do another plug like I did early in the show for Cinema and QSO. It's not just a Substack newsletter. It's not just a YouTube channel. It started as and still is a Substack newsletter where I write more formal written reviews for new films coming out. It really would be a huge help if you could go check that out and subscribe. And you can, find the link in the description below. You can also just go to your browser and type in cinemaandqso.substack.com. That's it for this week. Please, if you haven't already, please like this live stream. It really does help. If you haven't already, subscribe. We're really trying to grow the channel. Leave your comments below. Until next time, peace out, guys.